The following are the names and end-of-watch dates for the fallen officers in 2023. Chief of Police, Justin Clark McIntyre. End of watch, January 2023. Police Officer Carl Douglas Kimball. End of watch, January 12th. Police Officer Carl Douglas Kimball. End of watch, January 12th. Deputy Sheriff Darnell Calhoun. End of watch, January 13th. Supervisory Officer Jacqueline Montanero. End of watch, January 14th. Lieutenant Gerald T. Barbado. End of watch, January 16th. Mounted Police Officer Francis A. Gaynor. End of watch, January 18th. Police Officer Gerard James Coggins Sr. End of watch, January 23. Corrections Officer Lawrence Christopher Prather. End of watch, January 25th. Master Patrol Officer Lawrence Lamar C.J. Williams II. End of watch, January 28th. Lieutenant James V. Bubendorf. End of watch, January 28th. Police Officer Gonzalo Carreso, Jr. End of watch, January 31st. Lieutenant Michael George Petitor. End of watch, January 31st. Police Officer Sean Leonard Slugowski. End of watch, February 6th.
Police Officer Adid Fayez. End of watch, February 7th. Police Officer Peter E. C. Jerving. End of watch, February 7th. Police Officer Charles Herring. End of watch, February 9th. Police Officer Julian Becerra. End of watch, February 11th. Correctional Officer J. Miller. End of watch, February 11th. Police Officer James Mulbauer. End of watch, February 15th. Sergeant Christopher David Fitzgerald. End of watch, February 18th. Police Officer Joffrey Bernard Red. End of watch, February 18th. Detention Officer Kenneth Fowler. End of watch, February 19th. Lieutenant John Francis McArdle. End of watch, February 22nd. Police Officer Louis T. Herstick II. End of watch, February 28th. Police Officer Andres M. Vasquez Lasso. End of watch, March 1st. Deputy Sheriff Asan Hacker. End of watch, March 2nd.
Master Trooper James R. Bailey. End of watch, March 3rd. Detective Sergeant Mason Griffith. End of watch, March 12th. Lieutenant Frederick Charles Bowens, Jr. End of watch, March 13th. Deputy Sheriff Jeremy McCain. End of watch, March 20th. Patrolman Joseph Barlow. End of watch, March 20th. Sergeant David Poirier. End of watch, March 26th. Corporal Scotty Canizaro. End of watch, March 26th. Police Officer Garrett Crumby. End of watch, March 28th. Police Officer Timothy James Ewan. End of watch, March 31st. Detective Harry Stephalos. End of watch, April 1st. Detective Sergeant Nicholas Pepper. End of watch, April 2nd. Police Officer Emily Ann Beidenbach. End of watch, April 8th. Police Officer Hunter Timothy Scheel. End of watch, April 8th.
Senior Police Officer Trevor Abney. End of watch, April 9th. Deputy Sheriff Jason Stewart Jones, end of watch April 11th. Maintenance Foreman Michael Robert Keel, end of watch April 12th. Investigator Patrick J. Hogan, end of watch April 13th. Aviation Enforcement Agent Esteban Gabriel Pina, end of watch April 15th. Deputy Sheriff Josh Owen, end of watch April 15th. Reserve Corporal Joseph Johnson, end of watch April 15th. Captain Stephen J. Paveglio, end of watch April 23rd. Senior Investigator Nicholas Georgiadis, end of watch April 28th. Detective Troy David Patterson, end of watch April 29th. Lieutenant Richard Weber, end of watch May 1st. Captain William J. Gauron Sr., end of watch May 4th. Police Officer Ariana M. Preston, end of watch May 6th.
Deputy Sheriff Katie Leising, end of watch May 6th. Police Officer Robert Schisler, end of watch May 7th. Detective Jacob Arthur Bowe, end of watch May 7th. Port Police Officer Kimberly Sycophus, end of watch May 11th. Sergeant Joshua Lee Clusay, end of watch May 11th. Deputy Sheriff Brett Harris, end of watch May 13th. Police Officer Joseph Geschwind, end of watch May 17th. Sergeant Michael Konovich, end of watch May 19th. Deputy Sheriff Khalib Conley, May 22nd. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Ziegler, end of watch May 26th. Police Officer Horan Randy Tyler, end of watch June 1st. Corporal Sean Kevin Kelly, end of watch June 2nd. Sergeant Corey Maynard, end of watch June 2nd.
Chief of Police Anthony Rickerson, end of watch June 11th. Captain Christopher J. Garrow, end of watch June 12th. Police Officer Mark Christopher Wagner II, end of watch June 16th. Trooper Jock Felix Rugao Jr., end of watch June 17th. Lieutenant Stephen R. Galen, end of watch June 19th. Technical Sergeant Scott Charles Norcutt, end of watch June 20th. Trooper Aaron N. Smith, end of watch June 28th. Police Officer Carlos Taylor, end of watch June 30th. Sergeant Heather Glenn, end of watch July 3rd. Sergeant Charles A. Afanzowicz, end of watch July 4th. Detective Delberth Phipps Jr., end of watch July 4th. Deputy Sheriff Ty Michael Brown, end of watch July 5th. Police Officer Jessica Ebbinghausen, July 7th.
Deputy Sheriff John Durham, end of watch July 10th. Police Officer Jake Wallen, end of watch July 14th. Police Officer Anthony Ferguson, end of watch July 16th. Sergeant Edwin Maldonado Garcia, end of watch July 19th. Deputy Sheriff David Bachsecker, end of watch July 21st. Special Agent Robert C. Castiglione, Jr., end of watch July 24th. Lieutenant Michael Wood, end of watch July 26th. Deputy Sheriff Alejandro Martinez, end of watch July 28th. Sergeant William Cherry, end of watch July 29th. Deputy Marshal Barry P. Giglio, End of watch, July 31st. Sergeant Pedro Torres Santos. End of watch, July 31st. Deputy Sheriff Timothy J. Geyer. End of watch, August 1st. Police Officer Matthew Hare. End of watch, August 2nd.
Associate Director John Jack Hess. End of watch, August 4th. Police Officer Jonah Oswald. End of watch, August 7th. Officer Bill Sapaloo. End of watch, August 8th. Patrolman James M. Sides. End of watch, August 14th. Special Agent Patrick C. Bauer. End of watch, August 17th. Officer Brian Hawley. End of watch, August 18th. Police Officer Anthony Franconi. End of watch, August 25th. Detective Kurt E. Jones. End of watch, August 27th. Sheriff Robert Daniel Rogers. End of watch, August 29th. Deputy Sheriff Matthew Pearson. End of watch, August 29th. Chief of Police Frank Hayes, Jr. End of watch, August 30th. Governmental Affairs Liaison Michael Elaine Griffin. End of watch, September 4th. Detective Robert Garton. End of watch, September 6th.
Deputy Sheriff 2, Austin Smith Reidelhuber. End of watch, September 9th. Police Officer Kevin M. Cram. End of watch, September 13th. Deputy Sheriff Klinkenbrummer. End of watch, September 16th. Airman Trinity Leanne Reinhardt. End of watch, September 16th. Deputy Sheriff Shannon Eric Shane Lang Sr. End of watch, September 17th. Deputy Sheriff Marilyn Anjanette Mayo. End of watch, September 21st. Police Officer Darren McMichael. End of watch, September 21st. Police Officer Robert John Kerwin. End of watch, September 23rd. Captain John Robert Randolph III. End of watch, September 25th. Community Patrol Officer Christine Guerin Sandoval. End of watch, September 28th. Deputy Sheriff Jacob Eric Salrin. End of watch, September 29th. Correctional Officer 1, Robert Danforth Clark. End of watch, October 1st. Deputy Sheriff Tucker Blakely. End of watch, October 2nd.
Police Officer Chad Swanson. End of watch, October 4th. Sergeant Richard Carrero Mendez. End of watch, October 12th. Lieutenant Milton Resendez. End of watch, October 17th. Correctional Officer 1, Kelly Bernard Rolando. End of watch, October 22nd. Sergeant John Arden Jensen. End of watch, October 28th. Senior Police Officer Fukam Tran. End of watch, November 2nd. Detective James Michael Lett. End of watch, November 8th. Senior Police Officer George Pastore. End of watch, November 11th. Correctional Officer 3, Jovian Motley. End of watch, September 13th. Border Patrol Agent Freddie Ortiz. End of watch, November 14th. Captain Richard Lewis Ruiz Sr. End of watch, November 18th. Sergeant Michael Moran. End of watch, November 29th. Sergeant Michael Abate. End of watch, November 30th.
Trooper Alberto Felix. End of watch, November 30th. Sergeant James Michael Russ. End of watch, December 2nd. Technical Sergeant Christopher Philip Rock. End of watch December 3rd. Police Officer Paul Tracy. End of watch December 3rd. Sergeant Russell Earl Lavarle Jones. End of watch December 6th. Deputy Sheriff Paul Martin. End of watch December 6th. Trooper Robert M. Burney. End of watch December 9th. Chief of Police Christopher Byard Cummings. End of watch December 10th. Police Officer Daod Alexander Mingo. End of watch December 13th. Sergeant Stephen Gibson. End of watch December 13th. Police Officer Daniel P. Didato. End of watch December 18th. Deputy Sheriff Joshua Hamilton. End of watch December 18th. Police Officer Michael Kane Maxheimer. End of watch December 19th.
Court Officer Robert J. Silver. End of watch December 28th. Police Officer Tuan Q. Lee. End of watch December 29th. Sergeant Mark Andrew McIntyre. End of watch December 29th. Sergeant Philip Dale Nix. End of watch December 30th.
This ends the list of fallen officers for 2023. Now we will follow with the list of fallen canines for 2023.
Canine Griffith. End of watch February 13th. Canine Champ. End of watch February 15th. Canine Freddy. End of watch February 15th. Canine Duke. End of watch February 19th. Canine Lennon. End of watch March 9th. Canine Rudy. End of watch April 14th. Canine Hudson. End of watch May 24th. Canine Santos. End of watch May 26th.
Canine Barrett. End of watch June 1st. Canine Chase. End of watch June 6th. Canine Aaron. End of watch June 12th. Canine Harry. End of watch June 24th. Canine Kuno. End of watch July 2nd. Canine Falco. End of watch July 13th. Canine Sir. End of watch August 2nd. Canine Waro. End of watch September 2nd. Canine Rico. End of watch September 28th. Canine Debo. End of watch October 1st. Canine Freddy. End of watch October 16th. Canine Rio. End of watch October 19th. Canine Dexter. End of watch October 21st.
Canine Kenzo. End of watch October 27th. Canine Fury. End of watch November 11th. Canine Bane. End of watch November 16th. Canine Max. End of watch November 17th. Canine Broco. End of watch December 21st.
This completes the blessedly shorter list of fallen officers and canines for the year 2023.
Although they are gone, their honor, sacrifice, and dedication to duty lives on when we celebrate them with events like this. Take that time to pay tribute in your own way to the men and women in canines and their families.